Hello everyone, greetings and thank you very much for joining this virtual event on TCFD learnings and next steps today. We hope that you're all well and safe, and we're very grateful to you for joining and listening to us in these difficult times. I'm Lois Guthrie, if we could turn to the next slide please, and I'm going to host this event today with my colleague Luke Blower. We're both members of the Redefining Value team at the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, and we've both worked on climate-related financial disclosure for a number of years. On the next slide, you'll see that we are very delighted to be joined by 4 climate disclosure experts today who will be participating in a discussion a little later. I'll introduce you properly to them shortly, but just to say that all 4 experts have participated in TCFD Preparer Forums that have been facilitated by WBCSD, and we'll say more about that later. Just to start with some housekeeping on the next slide, as we must do, may I remind you that the webinar is being recorded, and we plan to make the recording as well as the presentation available at a later stage. For the moment, you are or should be muted to reduce any background noise. If this is not the case, could you kindly check that you are muted, please? We very much encourage you to make comments and ask questions throughout the event using the chat function. We have some time specifically set aside to answer your questions. The raise hand function is available if you wish to speak, and we'll try to use it where possible, but our preference is that you type your question in the chat box if you can, and then I'll invite you to speak as time allows, but we love to receive your comments. On the next slide, may I remind you that as ever, we operate under antitrust provisions. So we invite you to avoid discussion in any conversation of competitively sensitive topics, such as those listed on the slide. Next, I'll just take you through today's agenda. We're going to start with a little bit of context, so a look at what's happening in climate disclosure, particularly TCFD, some context and developments. Then I'll hand over to Luke, who will take you through a summary of WBCSD's recent activities and progress on TCFD related matters. The main part of our webinar today, about 50 minutes, will be devoted to hearing insights from our 4 experts who were participants on the Preparer Forums. And finally, we'll go through some learning and next steps. So we have about 90 minutes to do this. So by way of context, on the next slide, you'll see some very, very familiar images. In this global pandemic, our senses are really highly attuned to risk, and we're all familiar with the subject of risk from our work on climate change. The pandemic has affected all our lives and really highlighted the importance of preparing for and taking action on risks. Many commentators are drawing parallels between the devastation of the pandemic and the consequences of climate change, because both are non-linear risks that cause physical shocks and social and economic disruption. We're used to seeing these reports, headlines and analyses that warn us of climate risk, the specific impacts such as the drought that affected the River Rhine, the economic and of course human and environmental impact of Australia's bushfires. The chart in the bottom left-hand corner shows us the huge soaring in the cost of climate-related disasters between 1998 and 2017. So hence, the status of climate risk has been raised to climate emergency. On the next slide, we'll see some images that really speak of the role of finance in addressing these challenges. When the COP26 private finance initiative was launched, I think it was the Lord Mayor of London that said that private finance and public finance has been identified as the lever that will make necessary climate-related deliverables achievable. It's got the power to transform activity and behaviour and amplify the effectiveness of government policy and enable and accelerate the transition to the low-carbon economy. Hence, we see a lot of these finance initiatives. In fact, a recent report by UNEP that is offering an initial framework for response strategies to the COVID plan actually notes that now the low carbon transition is proven to be a good investment. In the top right hand corner there, you'll see a familiar picture of Governor Mark Carney, who in his famous September 2015 speech on the tragedy of the horizons recognised both the power of finance to mobilise the transition and the threat that by the time climate change impacts strike us, it might already be too late to protect financial stability. 2 years after the creation of the TCFD at the Tokyo Summit that Yoshihito will speak about in October 2019, Governor Carney warned companies and investors that they have 2 years to agree rules for reporting climate risks, or global regulators will devise rules and make them compulsory. In the same week that Governor Carney made that statement, the IMF called for fiscal measures to curb climate change alongside clear intentions from the EU and UK to make climate disclosure mandatory. So regulation on climate action and associated rules on climate disclosure look as if they are almost inevitable, the mandatory rules. But we as a business community have the opportunity to help shape that agenda. And I think that's one of the main messages that I would want us to reflect upon today as we hear how companies have been developing their disclosure practices. So on the next slide, we see that following the famous tragedy of the Horizons speech, G20 finance ministers instructed the Financial Stability Board to form the task force on climate-related financial disclosures. This was done in December 2015, and the purpose of the TCFD is to develop disclosure recommendations for more effective climate-related information that promotes more informed investment, credit and insurance underwriting decisions and enables stakeholders to understand better the concentrations of carbon-related assets in the financial sector and the financial system's exposure to climate-related risks. So this initiative, right from the start, was designed to be industry-led, to be market-led, and has a very senior, influential and geographically diverse task force constituting experts from the financial and non-financial sectors, consultants and others. And TCFD is we're very lucky at WBCSD to have a good relationship with the TCFD Secretariat, so we don't feel alone as we try to develop practices on climate-related financial disclosure. We feel that we have their input and support. So if we turn to the next slide, please, you'll see that the recommendations that were released in June 2017 are designed to help companies that have existing obligations to disclose material information, including principal risks, but by providing a coherent framework to enable that. And also to assist financial organisations that are looking for investor-grade, decision-useful, climate-related information that will inform their capital allocation and financial decisions. On the next slide, we see the recommendations, we see the reports that were issued in June 2017. As I'm sure you all know, there were 3 reports. The final report is a summary of what the task force decided and did. there is an annex, the annex on implementing the recommendations of the TCFD's recommendations, which is much longer and gives very specific implementation guidance for the 4 non-financial sectors that the TCFD identified as being high impact industries, and for financial sector organizations. That implementation guidance is supplemented by a technical supplement on the application of scenario analysis in applying the TCFD recommendations, and in particular the requirement on resilience, which we'll look at next. Did somebody want to make a comment? Can I be heard all right? No? Okay, good. On the next slide, we can see the recommendations themselves. Here we see that the recommendations fall into 4 pillars, where organisations are asked to make disclosures on the way in which they govern climate-related risks and opportunities, what their strategies are for dealing with those risks and opportunities, how they identify, assess and manage climate risks, and what metrics and targets they use to communicate how those risks are being managed, and what targets are being set for future management. So I'm sure you're all very familiar now with these 4 pillars of the TCFD's recommendations and the sub-recommendations beneath that just give a bit more detail about what the TCFD recommends companies should do. So on the next slide, we see something very, very unique actually and important here about the TCFD recommendations. It's the focus on financial impact. It's the task force on climate-related financial disclosure. The better disclosure of financial impacts of climate-related risk and opportunity is the key goal of the TCFD's work, because investors, lenders and insurance underwriters need to understand how climate-related risks and opportunities are likely to impact an organisation's future financial position. And that financial position is reflected in its income statement, cash flow statement and balance sheet, and affects assets and liabilities, capital and financing, revenue and expenditure. So the financial impacts, as you see from the top of the illustration here, are driven by the climate-related risks and opportunities to which the company is exposed, and its strategic and management and planning decisions on how to manage those risks and seize the opportunities. This really is a thorny issue, webinar participants. We know that, and the TCFD in its own work acknowledges that the financial impacts of these climate-related risks and opportunities are not always clear, they're not always direct, and assessing those impacts and how they are or should be reflected in financial statements is particularly challenging. We can see that on the next slide as we look at an extract from the TCFD's 2019 status report. As you might know, the TCFD monitors progress against the implementation of the TCFD recommendations. They issued a status report in 2018 and another one in 2019 showing how companies are doing. So they looked across the public reports of over 1,100 companies in the G20, and they were from 142 countries in 8 industries to assess the status of implementation. The TCFD has now a great deal of support. I believe they now have 1,200 official supporters, of which there are a proportion of financial firms that are supporters, 450 as noted here. What the status report shows us is that there's a lot of improvement being made. We must stress that, but there are also some areas where companies are clearly struggling. Now this is, if you want to look at this in more detail in the associated commentary, It's figure 9 from the TCFD's 2019 report, and the red cells actually show where there is the most difficulty with implementation. So 2 lines jump out immediately, don't they? It's line strategy C on the resilience, and this is the recommendation where TCFD asks companies to disclose how resilient their strategy is using scenario analysis as a tool for that assessment. And secondly, you'll see a lot of red in the line on risk management called integration into overall risk management. And we're going to talk about that in some detail later, why it is that there is difficulty integrating climate risk into companies' overall risk management processes. So just the next slide, I think, is my last one before I hand over to Luke. But I just wanted to mention the relevance of TCFD disclosure to the COP26 meeting that has now been postponed, and in particular to the private finance strategy that was launched earlier this year. So despite the pandemic and its effect on many plans, including the postponement of COP26, the TCFD itself is actually sticking rigorously to its plan and to its timetable. And in some ways, the delay and the implications of the pandemic seem to be increasing the level of ambition for the conference. When the delay was announced, Nick Stern referred to the opportunity in the recovery from the COVID-19 crisis to create a new approach to economic growth that's sustainable and a resilient economy in closer harmony with the natural world. He invites us to take that challenge and that opportunity. So the photograph you see on the right-hand side was taken at the launch of the private finance agenda. And its purpose is to encourage the private financial sector to support whole economy transition by identifying opportunities and managing risks associated with climate change. Governor Carney said at the launch that disclosures of climate risk must become comprehensive. Climate risk management must be transformed, and investing in a net zero world must go mainstream. So on the left-hand side of the screen, you can see the 3 R's, the 3 priorities that Governor Carney identified. And these are somewhat tests, if you like, for determining which organisations are ready for the transition and which are not. The first one, reporting, specifically refers to the TCFD. This part of the agenda looks at the extent to which the private sector can be mobilised based on climate-related financial information reported according to the TCFD recommendations. And what we're particularly looking for, I think, the whole community in preparation for COP26 is to see a coalition of countries and companies who are committed to climate disclosure. And all of you can be involved in that, and certainly can learn from the members we'll hear from later who have already demonstrated good practice. On the risk management side, of course, that is a vital component of assessing resilience of carbon strategies as well. And we have some tools at WBCSD that can help people with that. And Luke will mention those. And the third part of the strategy is to do with returns, to ensure that investors are able to make informed decisions on whether companies in their portfolio are transition ready. So what we're on, participants, is a journey of discovery, really, where we're learning this new language of climate disclosure, but hopefully that new language will enable a new world to be heard, and that's what we're looking for. So at that point, I'm going to hand over to Luke to take us through the next part of the event.
Thanks so much, Lois. So building on that context and introduction to TCFD, I just wanted to introduce some of the work that we as WBCSD have done that can support the implementation and interpretation of the TCFD recommendations. And starting off with a range of projects and resources within the Redefining Value program that Lois and I belong to. We have kind of two key components of that program that support TCFD efforts. It would be business decision making and external disclosure. And within the business decision making focus area, we have a piece of guidance developed with COSO, the Committee of Sponsoring Organisations of the Treadway Commission, that you can see on the top right hand corner here, that looks at how do you apply ERM, enterprise risk management, in an ESG context. How do you apply that to the characteristics and the criteria and the challenges associated with ESG risks? We also have some work focusing on governance and internal oversight, and you can see on the bottom right hand corner here some guidance that supports that kind of interpretation of management's role and the board's role in understanding ESG risks and opportunities. And we also have another project that focuses on performance management, so the kind of the processes, the systems, the accounting practices internally within an organization that support the understanding of performance and the management of performance, the execution of strategy. And on the external disclosure side, we have a range of resources. Our annual publication that reviews sustainability disclosures amongst our membership, that's Reporting Matters. The Reporting Exchange that includes a whole range of provisions, requirements, codes, frameworks, indicators around the ESG landscape. We have another project called Purpose-Driven Disclosure that's focusing on how do we meet investors' needs and in providing decision-useful information. And the guidance at the top left there, the ESG Disclosure Handbook, comes from that project and focuses on these kind of first principles and fundamental questions that can guide disclosure thinking. We have another project focused on assurance, so the quality of information and controls, and the guidance on the bottom left there is supporting that internal process to have a high quality data management system and control process in place. And then I guess most relevant, and I'll spend more time on that now, is of course the TCFD Preparer Forum effort. So our kind of specific response, and really fortunate in partnership with the TCFD, was to convene these preparer forums for priority non-financial sectors that the TCFD identified. And that includes oil and gas, electric utilities, chemicals, construction and building materials, food, agriculture and forest products, and we hope to finish up later in the year with autos. The purpose of these forums is to understand the current state of disclosure, identifying effective practices, thinking about common challenges, understanding user needs, and then thinking about disclosure development and opportunities to enhance disclosure over time. And just to give you an insight of who's participated in that, and we're fortunate enough to have some speakers from some of these groups participate in the panel and the discussion a little later. But we've got oil and gas, Equinor, Hilda from Equinor will speak a little later. We have ENI, Total, Shell, in electric utilities, Iberdrola, and now EDP, CLP. Hendrik from CLP will speak later, EDF and ENBW. In chemicals, AkzoNobel, DSM, Solvay, BASF, Sumitomo, and Yoshi from Sumitomo will speak later. We also have within the food, agriculture, forest products, Mondi, Nestle, Olam, Unilever, Stora Enso, and Syngenta. And in this afternoon's session, Chris Brown from Olam will speak. In the construction, building materials, ArcelorMittal, CRH, Lafarge Holcim, Lend-Lease, Saint-Gobain, and Skanska. And Amelia from Skanska will speak a little later. So we were really fortunate to have quite high level support for this effort, and picking up the kind of the introduction that Lois gave on the emphasis on that financial connection, integration with the processes, the role that sits under the CFO. We had a number of kind of supporting quotes and sort of resources provided by CFO offices across the Preparer Forum members. And I should say that this is a kind of really powerful part of the Preparer Forum process, and a really interesting learning from our members is that there's great value in this kind of cross-function collaboration within organizations. There's a need to bring in investor relations, strategy, planning and control, sustainability, communications, finance. There's a whole range of kind of disciplines that can bring something very valuable to this kind of TCFD journey. So in terms of the kind of outputs to date, we have 4 reports currently published and 1 in the works from construction. And you can see them in order here. On the left, oil and gas, top right, chemicals, bottom left, electric utilities, bottom right, food, agriculture, forest products. And within these reports, we've got a number of kind of key components responding to the structure of the TCFD recommendations, but in particular focusing on some of those kind of challenging areas and areas where we can explore disclosure developments and enhancement. So we had a particular focus in a number of the reports on the integration with enterprise risk management and connections with governance. In particular, in the latest food report, we looked at that kind of ERM connection. Many of the reports looked at measures of business resilience, responding to that strategy C recommendation, describing the resilience of your strategy, including use of scenario analysis. But interestingly, across the different forums, there's different ways of describing business resilience. And it's kind of really kind of fundamental learning, that some will focus on portfolio development and planning. Others will think about kind of long-term financial planning. Others will look at the kind of operational and physical resilience perspectives. And others will think about innovation and research and development. There's lots of different ways that you can describe business resilience, adaptation, mitigation, activity. We have a number of kind of insights on illustrative metrics that can kind of develop and support the TCFD's efforts around metrics. Forums have different perspectives on how that could be developed and how it could be structured. And we can get into some of that in a little bit. And then throughout, we have these kind of insights from investors, the key users for disclosures. And it's really fascinating to get kind of different perspectives from across the investment landscape of, those on the credit perspective, and those in equity, buy side, sell side, people who are specialists for the kind of particular industries or commodities that are looked at within this TCFD sector frame. They all bring kind of really valuable and insightful inputs. So just to pick up on some of the content that was included within those reports and the content of the discussions there, there's many things that I could have focused on, but I just want to pull out some of the kind of key things that stood out to me, and I think draw on the kind of some of the conclusions and discussions amongst the forum. So within the oil and gas effort, we particularly looked at this thinking about portfolio resilience and how can you demonstrate portfolio resilience, and this kind of the positioning, the evaluation of the portfolio as we move to a low carbon economy and to net zero. So there's lots of different ways that you can demonstrate this kind of financial resilience, portfolio resilience. And on the left-hand side, you can see some of the kind of key financial measures that support that, as well as perhaps some of the assumptions and parameters that can help scenario analysis and understand the kind of sensitivities associated with change in carbon price or change in commodity price, for example. So just to run through some of these here, the pink diagram there, it's taken from Equinor, and perhaps he will speak a little bit about this later on. But there they've applied the IEA Sustainable Development Scenario as a kind of sensitivity on, applying that to change in net present value. Just below that, you can see Total's diagram that shows this and change over time, aligned with the IEA scenario and the emissions profile. In the top right, you can see a range of financial measures from E&I, describing sensitivities and carbon pricing implications, rate of return, break even. And this is kind of demonstrating the financial position. And then on the bottom right, you can see some of the metrics measures included within Shell's scenarios that they run to understand a range of possible futures and how they may move that into their planning cycles. So moving to the Electric Utilities Forum, there we had a really fascinating discussion on appropriate metrics and measures to kind of describe the role of electric utilities through the low carbon transition. And you can see some of those on the left hand side here. So a description of how renewable capacity is changing, how generation is changing, level of investment, and then also really crucially on the bottom left, stepping away from the generation part of the business to look at that kind of non-generation enablers. So the customer solutions, the EV charging infrastructure, smart networks, transmission and distribution, storage, batteries. These are all really fundamental levers and enablers of the low carbon transition. So it's appropriate that they are described and characterized. And on the right hand side, you can see a range of examples. So at the top there, we've got investment from CLP. On the bottom, we have some descriptions of clean energies activities from EDP. In the middle, we've got Enel talking about how they're developing EV infrastructure and those kind of non-generation enablers. On the right-hand side, we've got Iberdrola talking about the breakdown of investment across different technologies and how that supports the reduction in emissions profile, but also supports kind of financial returns over time. And I should just say that both this example, this set of examples, and the previous example are directly responding to the TCFD recommended disclosure on the impact of climate-related risks and opportunities on the business, strategy, and financial planning. This is kind of the companies describing their response, their position, their development plans, thinking about the resilience of their efforts, and this kind of connection back to mainstream planning. From the chemicals group, we had a particular focus on scenario analysis, and please do take a look in that report for that insight. But I actually pulled out here the perspectives on sustainable solutions and how the chemical companies describe this development within their portfolio of particular products, particular services that support sustainable outcomes, and they have various criteria that are related to climate change, climate mitigation, energy efficiency, supporting I guess avoidance and mitigation within their customers as well. And across the forum, there's different ways of characterizing it, and it's a work in progress in supporting kind of alignment with specific methodologies and standards. But the kind of key thing to say here is that it's very important across this kind of thinking of TCFD implementation that we're talking about the opportunity, and that investors understand something on the size of the opportunity and the kind of financial planning and resourcing associated with that, as well as that environmental outcome, how it can support climate mitigation and adaptation. And then from the last release, the Food, Agriculture, Forest Products Forum, as I said before, there was a particular focus there on risk management, and we had quite a comprehensive list of metrics. But I wanted to pull out actually this diagram that looked at resilience. It's a very relevant term at the moment. And we thought a little bit about what does it mean for this kind of suite of activities, this grouping of companies, food, agriculture, forest products, to be resilient in a climate context, in a changing climate. And there's a number of components, I think, there. We need to think about the various shocks and stresses that can impact a company. We need to think about changes in space and time that impacts. We need to think about the company's response. And then really fundamentally, you need to think about the kind of transformations that are required through new business models, products, distribution of value, kind of new ways of doing things, so that we can move to this this position of having positive agriculture, positive forestry. And again, just wanted to highlight that I think this is directly responding to that recommended disclosure within the TCFD's recommendations of describing the resilience of a strategy. If a company can begin to describe how it thinks about and responds to these components in this diagram, going a long way to meeting that request to describe their resilience. So with that, I'm going to hand back to Lois.
Thank you very much, Luke. Just a few points to to note before we move into the discussion. First of all, that as you'll have seen, all of these reports contain lots of examples. I think there are on average 40 examples in each report. And I know I spent 10 years in consulting and then went in-house, and it's very different being told that you should do something to actually having to execute that instruction yourself. And there's nothing like looking at an example of how another company does it to give you ideas, inspiration, reassurance. So I encourage you to look at those examples, and should add that some of our companies also have their examples in the TCFD status reports. There's lots of really good examples in there. Two other things to note. I think Raoul has raised a question about opportunity, and I hope this, what Luke presented showed you that we do actually give quite a lot of attention in our reports to the way in which climate opportunities are leveraged in response to the transition. And some of our companies actually you could describe as being architects of the transition through the opportunity they have to respond to the challenges of the day. And the last thing I just want to interject here before we move on is that I think when you hear from our speakers, you'll be very excited about the TCFD Preparer Forums. We have, as Luke said, published five of the forums, and construction will be published in June. And we will have one other Preparer Forum later in the year, we hope, with the auto industry. I'm afraid that will be the end of our formal TCFD Preparer Forum work. However, there will be lots of opportunity for you to become engaged in other ways, and we're going to describe those right at the end. I just wanted to make sure we cleared up some of the things we've seen in chat before we move on. So now this is the best bit of our webinar today. We're going to have the discussion with our four experts. I will ask each of our experts to introduce themselves. You can see their names and their titles on the screen, I hope. But I'm going to start, before we move into the discussion proper, by asking Yoshihisa Takazaki, who's a manager in the Sustainability Division of Sumitomo Chemical, if he will update us on the activities in which he's been involved in Japan. There have been some very significant developments there. Over to you, Yoshi.
Thank you, Luis-san. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. Thank you for giving me this opportunity. I'm Yoshihisa Takasaki, working for Sumitomo. We at Sumitomo Chemical has regarded climate change as one of the highest priority challenges facing our society. We are actively working to reduce GHG gas emissions and at the same time, these climate-related opportunities. And we also recognize that disclosing information on climate action reflects the demands of the current era. So we use the framework of TCFD recommendations and actively communicate our efforts to stakeholders. For example, in June 2017, we supported the TCFD recommendations concurrently with their publication. And as Lisa noted, since December 2018, we participated in the WBCSD TCFD Preparer Forum. In reflection, through dialogue with investors and other companies, while also learning best practices, we somehow contributed to the development of TCFD guidance and also had a lot of learnings. Here in Japan, TCFD is gaining momentum. Industrial and financial community will collaborate, and also with the full support of the Japanese government, TCFD implementation measures are encouraged. As a consequence, we saw the sharp rise in the number of Japanese companies that support TCFD. Also, the number of CDP, Carbon Disclosure Project, climate A list of the Japanese companies also increased. Taking this opportunity, please look at the slide. I would like to share one story of the TCFD Summit held in Tokyo last October. Our Chairman Tokura sat on the panel, then delivered the following key messages. One, it is certain that demand for the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions will grow even stronger globally. But against this backdrop, we, as a chemical sector industry, should play a greater role in delivering products that contribute to the reducing greenhouse gas emissions across the global value chain. And also, we chemical industry offer products that help to adapt to climate change. Second, we would like to strive to achieve a virtuous cycle of environmental sustainability and economic growth through effective dialogue and close dialogue with investors, especially focusing on our initiative such as Sumika Sustainable Solutions Program. We call it the Triple S. And this is an in-house program that certify our eco-friendly products and relevant research and development. Together with WBCSD member companies and other institutions going forward, we would like to continue these efforts. This is my initial comment. Thank you for your attention.
Yoshi, thank you very much for contributing that. I think we've all watched the developments in Japan with great interest, and certainly, you know, the Japanese government has been so supportive. The summit in October was really a very prestigious event. Our own Chairman Peter Backer was at the event, and one thing that really struck me was the focus on innovation driving the transition. So thank you for sharing that with us, Yoshi. I'm now going to move into the discussion part, and I'm going to start with Hilda Roed on the basis that she was a participant in our very first Preparer Forum for the oil and gas industry. And Hilda, could I ask you to start with some brief insights about you, your company, your job, and how your experience of implementing the TCFD affected them, the challenges you faced, the benefits you've enjoyed, the experience of being in the forum. Over to you, Hilda.
Thank you, Lois, and looking forward to share some experiences. So I'm Hilda Roed, Vice President Sustainability at Equinor. And for those who don't know Equinor, we used to be called Statoil. So we're an energy company headquartered in Norway, focusing primarily on oil and gas, but also expanding significantly within renewables, offshore wind in particular. It's one of the world's largest natural gas exporters. And we joined the Oil and Gas Preparer Forum, TCFD Preparer Forum, I think it was in 2017, together with Shell, Total and Eni. This was a very useful step for us in order to improve our climate risk assessment and disclosures, But we actually have a history on climate risk disclosures that goes further back. Because already, I think it was in 2013 or 2014, we got a shareholder proposal from someone called the Aiming for A Coalition, asking us to disclose or test the resilience of our portfolio against the range of scenarios from the International Energy Agency. And back then, that was not something that you could find many examples of around the world, and we were scratching our heads how we should do this. But we actually started then to develop a practice and have of stress testing our portfolio and trying to also quantify climate risk. And since 2015, we have reported annually on results of a stress test where we compare our portfolio of projects around the world with what kind of impact you would see in the sustainable development scenario of the International Energy Agency or other energies and scenarios, and we look at the impact on net present value. So for us, it was a very natural step when the TCFD was launched, or actually before, to engage with the TCFD, share some experiences, and also to start implementing the framework. And I think some of the benefits of the TCFD is, I think, the overall structure of governance, strategy, risk, and metrics is very, very good, and quite, actually, it makes a lot of sense for most companies. So it has helped us to become more systematic in the way we embed climate risk into our internal processes, but also how we disclose this. It provides a more standardized way and terminology for disclosing climate risk. I also think one of the strengths and benefits is that it focuses on the financial risks and not only on the sustainability impacts we have on the society, which are also very important, but there are a lot of other frameworks addressing that. Although quantifying this financial impact is also the most challenging part. And I think for us, the TCFD Preparer Forum, learning from peers, discussing industry-specific relevance and metrics and methodologies was very, very helpful. So on the challenges, briefly, I'd just like to say for us, it's definitely the time horizon and the long time horizon and the high uncertainty of climate that is the main challenge, because there are so many outcome spaces and we do not know the probability of different scenarios, etc. So the outcome space is so big, so it's very difficult to quantify and be specific. So there's a high degree of uncertainty, and that is sort of the main headache. How do you treat that uncertainty, and how do you balance this with other types of risks? And we have embedded this in our enterprise risk management, but most of our other risk management is very much about the next 12 months. So when you start looking at risks that go to 2050, it's challenging, but also interesting because it opens up a lot of strategic questions. So this has also fueled a lot of interesting strategy discussions with our top management and in close collaboration with the corporate finance area and also our strategy colleagues. So I think that's the introduction from me.
Thank you very much, Hilda. And it's interesting that you said that one of the first things that happened in your journey was this shareholder proposal for Aiming for A. I think every single one of our preparer forums have concluded that climate disclosure will be greatly improved through closer dialogue between companies and investors. It's one of the main things that's come out of this work, and one of the things that we're hoping to focus on. So thank you for those observations. Hendrik, I'm going to move to you next, because the electric utilities were in the second batch of our preparer forums, and tell us about yourself, the challenges and benefits of being in the preparer forum, and your experience of TCFD implementation so far.
Sure. Thanks very much for having me. Just to recap a little bit in terms of CLP, in case you haven't heard of us. We are based out of Hong Kong as an electric utility, been operating here for over almost 120 years. And we have significant investments in mainland China, India, and Australia, as well as Southeast Asia. And decarbonization and the energy transition has been part of what we've been tracking and have put and embedded in our strategy for some time. We had initially published a climate vision 2050 back in 2007 and updated that over the years, and most recently provided a new iteration of that at the end of last year. So the TCFD recommendations that came through, it was very much aligned with our thinking of how we need to transition our portfolio, how we need to reduce the carbon intensity of the electricity that we supply to our customers. And it was most welcome in the sense that it provided some guidance and recommendations of how disclosure should be looking and what sort of priorities companies should be setting. The governance piece, for instance, was something that wasn't difficult in the sense that we have had very strong systems in place for governance, but climate already was embedded within that as well. So it was quite timely in the sense that we were able to showcase the thinking we've committed towards climate through that. In terms of our experience with implementation, the Preparer Forum was tremendously helpful, I have to say. So I very much appreciate the work that Lois and Luke had done over the time. We had the discussions with the other utilities to come up with the guidance document. Because there's some key questions in there and still remaining in terms of what and how to, as Lois already mentioned in her introduction, how to conduct scenario analysis and how to then embed that into your risk management process. This is, for us, equally so the remaining or outstanding piece in terms of integrating the recommendations. We've made some progress on that. We have this year hopefully further strengthened our disclosure, so I'd be happy to get feedback actually from participants or anyone for that matter in terms of how we have modified our disclosure for 2019. We just published a report 2 months ago, and we did really take to heart quite a bit of the pieces that we discussed as part of the Preparer Forum. And one thing that sort of stood out for me is, and Luke showed it on the slides earlier, is the metrics and that were part of that publication that electric utilities should be tracking. So we came together and it took some time, I think, to quite a bit of discussion to get some consensus on what these metrics should be amongst the Preparer Forum members. And that in itself was quite useful, and hopefully other utilities will be open to adopt that. But what was so important for us at CLP then was that we could then push internally as well, that we should further strengthen our disclosure to really demonstrate that we are part of the energy transition, that we have taken that path, and that we are making progress in that regard. So, for instance, the investment piece, the operating earnings, and splitting that by asset type instead of having the standard figure as part of our financial disclosure is something that's that was new to us, and that really then also demonstrates where we put our money in addition to the capital investment piece. So overall, it was a very good experience. TCFD, I think, should just takes time, I think, in terms of implementing the recommendations throughout. It's not something any company can do in a year or in a short term. The piece around scenarios and how to manage risks, climate risks going forward, that is outstanding to some extent, because also the recommendations themselves and the guidance that's out there is still limited in terms of specificity. So to that extent, we are in the process of developing our own path, and so are many other companies, I believe. And hopefully we can all then come together over time to have sort of a common vision on that. And I saw on one of the slides the open source piece for scenarios is also under development. So that's quite interesting and promising, and should possibly, or hopefully, be helpful for everyone to go down that track. So maybe I'll just stop there for now as part of the introduction.
Thank you, Hendrik. What strikes me about what you said is you've done lots, you've achieved lots, you've been thinking about this for many years, but of course, this is still a work in progress. And, you know, I just want to, you mentioned the scenario open source work. I just want to reiterate that, you know, the TCFD is aware of this, that they're aware that we're still on the so-called implementation curve. So that's the beauty of these webinars, that we have an opportunity to share and, you know, work out how we can address these, some of the questions that remain together. So thanks, Hendrik. Now, Emilia, may I hand over to you next to tell us about your company, your experience, and the Construction Forum experience as well.
Thank you very much. And also interesting to hear the experiences from the other companies here in the other preparer forums. My name is Emilia Hagberg. I'm Senior Sustainability Manager at Skanska. I'm heading up the sustainability reporting. And for those of you that doesn't know, Skanska is a construction development company based in Sweden, but we have business in 10 countries in Central Europe, in Nordics, in UK, and the US. And sustainability and carbon emission reduction has been part of our business for a very long time, and we started to report externally our carbon emissions for more than 10 years. And of course, I mean, our business stands for about 40% of the energy related carbon emissions. So this is a crucial area for us. But what we have seen now is the increased pressure from politics, from customers and investors in all our markets the last years. And also the push for more transparency when it comes to Scope 3. And for us, as a construction company, the Scope 3, which basically is materials, is very crucial. So for us to cooperate in the Preparer Forum with all the value chain is very important, because then we can share both knowledge, experience, and also a common approach. So one of our main reasons for joining this Preparer Forum is for ourselves to be prepared for what we can see will be mandatory in the coming years, to learn, to share knowledge and experiences, and also, I mean, to increase our own readiness. And it has been very, very valuable. I think we share a lot of the challenges, and what has been mentioned here before, the scenario analysis is one of those that are challenging. And the time horizon and a new way of looking about scenarios is one of those. Construction is, I mean, we are used to looking into risks in projects and to avoid risks, but to have climate risks is another way of dealing with them. What we have done during and since we were in the Preparer Forum, in the midst of that work, we were setting our own climate target for the whole group, which was to achieve net zero emissions 2045. And now there is a focus throughout our business to develop roadmaps of how to achieve that. And the very focus is on business case, because that is how we do it. And for us, risk mitigation, when it comes to both mitigation and adaptation, is to identify the business opportunities, because that is, we can both reduce emissions, but we can also support the society for a more resilient society. We have also continued to improve the consistency and equality in the reporting, especially when it comes to Scope 3. And also reviewing different way of analyzing how we can have the financial measurements close connected to the green area and climate. We have been doing that before and identifying what we call green revenue, but now we need to review that and have it closer to the TCFD recommendations. One thing is investigating internal carbon pricing and also connected to risk awareness. One thing that is very interesting is the intense dialogue with investors. The last year, a lot of them have reached out to us, both to hear about our performance, but also to learn as they are implementing the EU taxonomy and also the TCFD recommendations. So it is, they're pushing us, but they are also learning from us, which is, I think, is very, very important, and that also supports, it's a support for us in that dialogue to have been in this forum. Another benefit from our participation is that there has been a further integration between sustainability, investor relations, and other reporting and financial departments in our company, because we need to work together as well as with the risk management, because and that is, it has been pushed by this participation, and we had members from different departments in this work. So those are some of the learnings and some of the actions that we have been taking since our work. I can stop there and then we'll continue the discussion.
Thank you ever so much, Amelia. I mean, having heard from all of you, sort of picking up this sense of, if I was listening and I wasn't so familiar with the TCFD, I wasn't so far along in my implementation journey, I might be thinking, what am I being asked to do here by the TCFD? What are these experts telling me that they're doing? And I think the activity falls into a few categories. There's integrating, that's it, integrating climate into risk and governance processes and other internal decision-making and assessment processes. There's measuring. You've mentioned, some of you have mentioned Scope 3 already, and you know, what is it that we need to measure and how will we do it? There's a deciding element to this. You know, what evaluation processes, what assessment tools will we use in order to make decisions about climate? There's an acting part, which is, you know, what actions shall we take about climate, including what shall we disclose in our public disclosures? And there's the complying part. You mentioned, Amelia, the significance of the EU taxonomy and how that might well drive change in climate-related financial disclosure as well. So I'd like to sort of just open it up to you. We know each other. Let's make this a free-flowing discussion. Given that you have these different integrating, measuring, deciding, acting, complying type dynamics, can you give us a sense for those people who may not be so far in their journey of what that entails internally? I want to look at the internal aspect and some of the technical aspects and some of the more sort of public aspects of this, but internally, what does that entail? How do you do that, the integrating bit? Who wants to go first? Raise a hand, colleagues, I can see you. Hilda.
Yes, happy to give it a try, or at least tell how we have gone about integrating. For us, it's been very important to have this as part of our regular risk management, enterprise risk management process, which means that we basically follow the same cycle of updates, reports that go to the board of directors, etc., because that gives regularity to it, and also, you know, is in line with this governance principle. So getting it into the overall enterprise risk management process has been important. So that, of course, means collaboration with the risk management function. But even more so, some of the CFO colleagues, and that was mentioned also by Emilia, so economic analysis, etc. So, and that onboarding can take some time, but I think getting it into the regular procedures is important. And then I would say that that's also, there are some challenges there, because at least for our company, looking so far ahead and using scenarios is perhaps not the way you address other types of risk. So you also need to get together people from different disciplines and look at this slightly different, but getting it into the overall risk management process that goes on every year, but maybe using some different tools so that you establish also this as a practice is at least what has been very helpful for us, and making sure that the CFO and you know, the CEC, the Corporate Executive Committee, that all of these are informed and involved, so that it doesn't become a sort of sustainability discipline exercise.
Yes, thank you, Hilda. I mean, certainly from our work with the TCFD Secretariat, we know that because of what they discovered in their 2019 status report about this difficulty with integration, it's something that, you know, we're working with them on to see if we can help explain an integration process. I mean, certainly one of the reasons for focus on integration is that for many companies, climate isn't really a standalone risk. It's a risk that actually affects all of the existing risks, and perhaps those that aren't yet known. And that really is the rationale for integration, along with, as you said, Emilia, the business case. But the integration, we find, really does involve it's two things really: getting the climate embedded and integrated into existing processes, but also recognizing the unique characteristics of climate, which, as you rightly said, Hilda, do entail perhaps using some different tools. And if you look at the Food, Agriculture and Forest Products report we just produced, you'll see a whole section in there about the need to take account of different criteria in assessing risks that might not already be in your existing risk management processes. So you'd go beyond the sort of probability type criteria to look at velocity, speed of onset, etc. So yes, new tools indeed. But any other insights, Emilia or Hendrik, you'd like to give on integration? Hendrik?
Yeah, I think we were quite lucky to the extent, as mentioned earlier, that we did already have a vision for climate and our decarbonization strategy. So that was extremely helpful, and it did enable or did allow for governance processes to be built into our systems that consider climate, and also the strategy piece as well. But then what's so different with TCFD is that it really forces you to dig a little deeper. So we have to go from a vision to a climate strategy. And then ultimately, what does that mean for financial implications? So what does that mean at the end of the day in terms of our business? Are we resilient enough? So there's a certain level of openness that we have within the organization to go down that track. But does very, very quickly cross over with other departments and their remit in terms of setting corporate strategy, for instance. And it's about really trying to help them understand that climate and climate risks, as well as the opportunities that come with it, should be embedded within that strategy work. We have had a risk register in place for a number of years that looks at the short-term implications of climate. So the more standard type operational risks and looking maybe 2 to 3 years ahead. And that in itself is a good starting point, but what we're looking at now is, okay, we need to look at 10 years out at least. What risks do we need to track? Are we prepared? What other investments need to happen? And again, this is where then quickly crosses over with other functions from the operations side, from the investment side, that itself should be helping to make our business more resilient. So the TCFD framework itself is tremendously comprehensive, and it really does force a company to think along the lines of seeing the horizon, if you like, the climate horizon, and it allows for companies to go down a track that they may not be usually thinking about. So it is a work in progress for us, but it is something that we very much need to be looking after. And the Preparer Forum, again, was an excellent piece for that.
Thanks, Hendrik. So yes, I'll come to you certainly, Emilia. Just for our webinar listeners, I think what we're hearing is use what you already have in-house, the same tools, the same processes, for example, the risk register, but maybe adapt them because of time horizons and the different characteristics of climate change. Get the finance colleagues involved, but also others, maybe even the corporate secretary and the strategy team, and recognize that they all play a part in this jigsaw of climate integration. That's part of what we're hearing, just as tips to capture. But Emilia, what would you add on the integration side?
I would like to add on to what Hilde said about the different competences that need to cooperate. I mean, if you come from the sustainability side, you have a totally different language than if you come from the risk management or financial perspective. And now those competences and also time frame are totally different. And now we need to cooperate, and that is a bit challenging. When it comes to integrating the risk, I mean, that is the risk management. That is, we have started that, but of course we're not, we haven't reached all the way yet. But when we had our sustainability and annual reporting, there was separate parts a couple of years ago. So we had the sustainability risks, and then we had the business risks. But when we started to integrate that, it made it much more clear for everyone that all of them are relating to the business. So we kind of did the integration through our reporting. So that was one interesting learning. The other thing is about what we have seen now, looking at the COVID pandemic, and when we are looking into the future, kind of post-COVID, that we all are kind of preparing for what's happening. Then it has been clear that we have this need for multidisciplinary knowledge, because we need to look in short-term and long-term, and we need to understand different kind of perspective. This is about resilience, of this pandemic, and then the sustainability perspective is crucial. So I think that have been and this broader understanding from the organization how important that knowledge is. And also it's interesting to see that how the sustainability perspective also stresses the opportunities. So from a company that is very, very risk awareness when it comes to financial risks and project risks, the sustainability perspective is also about finding opportunities in a uncertain world. So that is also an interesting learning.
It is, thank you. And I think you've all spoken very eloquently about, embedding climate just takes some sort of cultural, conceptual, behavioral work internally to perhaps, even if we don't share language right at the moment, we can share meaning. And the meaning really is, this is a business risk, like other risks. We might not be able to deal with it in exactly the same way, but the meaning is, it's a risk like other risks to our business with different characteristics. So thank you for that. Having looked at those sort of cultural, conceptual, behavioral aspects of integration, I wonder if we could spend a few minutes on some technical issues to do with measurement. I mean, a number of you have mentioned that part of our work in the Preparer Forums was to prepare, to look at the metrics we use, the metrics financial, operational, scope 3, which some of you have mentioned as being a thorny issue. Who would like to give some insights on the sort of the technical measurement aspects of climate that are difficult, but actually are the things probably that are most looked at in climate reports? People want to see how the measurements are manifested. Anybody want to start with some insights into that? Amelia, thank you.
I can start on that. I mean, the most obvious way of reporting regarding climate is, of course, the performance. And we are on different levels and different matureness when it comes to the reporting. And in our own emissions, scope 1 and 2, that is, of course, more mature. And we are now working on scope 3, and that is challenging. But even more challenging is to connect that to the financial aspects. And I mean, that is actually what TCFD is looking at, and also to look into the future. So it's one thing to look back, which is challenging enough, but look into the future is a really tricky thing. But I think that it is very important to have an understanding of your performance if you want to look into the future. What we have done before, as I shortly mentioned, is that we have had a definition of what we call is green revenue. And now we're updating that, as there is now much more clear, or it's going to be a clear definition, what is green, very much due to EU taxonomy that we are aligning to. And that is, of course, great support. And then we can connect that in different ways to financial figures, both in performance. Right now, we in our report, we have disclosed how, from our development projects, which of them, how large part of them have the highest level of certifications, which is about 90%. So that is one way to show how, and also the level of external loans we have, how much are green loans. So we try to find different ways of disclose the connection between green, climate, and the financial.
I think you've hit one of the main challenges on the head there, Amelia. Yes, I agree. And Hilda and Hendrik, if you have some comments to make on the measuring aspects, I think the connecting point that Amelia's made is very important. How do we connect the sort of cultural, conceptual, behavioural things we might have achieved in embedding with the things that we measure and with the decisions that go on to be made? What have you actually seen any evidence where measurements affect strategic decision making, for example? Hilda.
A challenging question. I have to say, you know, in the Preparer Forum, this is what we struggled the most with, because there were lots of metrics and possible metrics, but it's very easy to revert back to the old impact type of or environmental impact type of metrics. And in some instances, we see that the metrics we did suggest are more sort of proxies than actual financial indicators, because you can report on emissions, on scope 3 emissions, etc., but really sort of capturing the financial impact is so difficult. So I would say, I think this is a journey. I see that all the companies in the Preparer Forum have evolved since we were in the Preparer Forum. I don't think we have sort of fully landed on this set of metrics yet, but there is an evolvement of methodologies, and it improves over time. So there are some financial metrics. Some were actually already disclosed in the annual reports, such as around break-even and reserves, etc. And it was maybe more about highlighting the relevance of those in a climate context. And then some new type of measurements more on the emission intensity of your total portfolio, etc., have evolved since then and are now becoming standard metrics. So I would say we're not quite there yet. We're on the journey.
Thanks, Hilda. And Hendrik, any comments, particularly on this measurement deciding interface?
Yeah, no, I thought what was particularly fascinating as part of the discussion we had for the Preparer Forum is how do we demonstrate to the market that a company is on track or part of the energy transition. And that's really the crux of the matter for the electric utility sector, is moving away from thermal generation towards zero carbon, non-carbon renewable sources. And how do we make that a reality for all markets and for everyone? And that's where we landed on in terms of, let's start with some illustrative metrics, as we call them. So if you were to disclose along these lines, as we have published, you should be in a position to illustrate or showcase that you are indeed on track and part of the energy transition. And that's along the lines of some very generic or standard, if you like, scope 1, 2, 3 metrics, or what type of assets you have and the percentage breakdown of those, and as well as mentioned earlier, operating earnings and capex. But we also added a new bit and what we call the non-generation enablers, and that's really showcasing how much have you invested in electric vehicles, for instance, or electric vehicle charging infrastructure, for instance. How have you enabled broader electrification of industry and energy efficiency within for the customers that you serve? So this is really what I thought was most useful and as a really impactful output. And more importantly, though, it was us as a sector that came together to decide these are the ones that we should be prioritizing as part of disclosure. This is what we would like to give you, to the investment community, as being the pieces that we think are most important and most illustrative to demonstrate progress. And it's not the other way around. I think that was very important for us as part of that group. We don't want to be dictated by the investment side or rating agencies for that matter, or ranking services as to what we should be disclosing for electric utilities, but it's the other way around. We, at the end of the day, understand the industry best, and we know what the energy transition means, and we are adopting our business models along those lines. And this is how we can demonstrate to you that indeed we are working towards that with these metrics.
I think that's a very good observation, Hendrik. One of our members rather forcefully said to us, what is the exam question here? And I think you've articulated it very well. The question is, are you on track to flourish in or actually be an architect of the carbon transition? So thank you for that. Now, it pains me to say, participants and members, that we are running out of time, but before by way of drawing the discussion to a close, I want to invite each participant just to give one, hopefully 1 minute reflection on if you were asked to identify something that needs to change in sort of TCFD infrastructure reporting, a sort of, your fairy godmother's here asking you, what is your TCFD wish? Do you have one to share? Let's close with that thought. Hendrik, go.
Well, I think I mentioned it already, but it is the scenario analysis piece. It is about having consensus on how to go about doing that, how to demonstrate that your business is resilient with a changing climate, and the sheer complexity of creating scenarios can be daunting for anyone, for any organization. If you have a very large team or good amount of resources that you can devote to that, that's great. But I would imagine many companies do not. So having that guidance, having that detail around that in terms of how to achieve scenarios, how to develop scenarios, and then how to further translate those scenarios into financial implications, I think that's really still the crux of the matter. And if we really want to go down that track, which is what TCFD is advocating for and what we stand behind, to demonstrate the financials.
It is a universally agreed thorny issue. I'm with you totally, Hendrik. I mean, for just to share insights from across the board, one thing that seems to have helped people in their grappling with scenario analysis is to focus on the question of we're being asked to state whether we're resilient. If we start with thinking about what resilient might look like, we can calibrate our scenario analysis to that, but that's just a sort of overall reflection. Yoshi, did you want to say something to close?
Thank you. The brief comment and about the current regulatory and policy developments of the TCFD. I duly acknowledge that the TCFD reporting, the first philosophy is that the non-regulatory, consensus basis and step-by-step information disclosure approach. And as a TCFD implementation practitioner, I feel prefer the current philosophy because the current TCFD framework has certain flexibilities for interpretation. It is somewhat ambiguous, but it has a room for interpretation. This allows us to think in earnest what is an effective and what is a material focused climate-related information disclosure. So I prefer by developing the TCFD guidance with the best practices and the daily engagements with stakeholders. Last year, personally, I had a lot of engagement opportunities with financial institutions, but it has a very good learning process. So going forward, we are able to communicate the company's value creation programs with stakeholders, continue in an effective manner. Thank you.
Yes, but very good point. And again, this has come up on all forums, the importance of dialogue in order to improve climate disclosure. Emilia, Hilda, if I can ask you to be very brief in your closing thoughts, please. Who would like to go first? Emilia.
Okay, I can start. I would say three things. One thing that in our group is the alignment to other frameworks. The disclosure in the TCFD recommendations are aligned with other frameworks like GRI or what different investors are asking for to make it more easy for us. The other thing is to make sure that investors ask the right things. We had discussions on for the granularity of the questions. Sometimes they ask very detailed, and there was kind of a common opinion in the group that maybe you don't get what you want if you asked on some very detailed level. So to understand the business and to have that dialogue with us, what do you exactly want? Do you really want to have detailed information about Skanska's 10,000 projects? No, probably not. And the third, and also about R&D, that was very much the only thing that was the level of R&D, what's expected to describe how we kind of meet the future. And that was also discussion that there are other ways more to describe how we are cooperation, partnership, things like that.
Yes, thank you. Three very valid points. Thank you, Emilia. And Hilda, briefly, please. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, building on what has been said, I think first of all, this collaboration across is really key to be successful and impactful. So strategy, sustainability, CFO function, risk, get together and work together. And then I think it's important that this scenario analysis, very sophisticated scenario analysis, that the perfect doesn't become the enemy of the good. I think for a lot of SMBs and others that can be very daunting, and there's a lot of value in starting to look at governance, starting to assess your risks maybe from a more qualitative perspective, and then you can evolve over time. So see it as a journey rather than going all in on the most sophisticated stress testing.
Thank you. That's reassuring advice. Thank you. I want to thank you all, Hendrik, Hilda, Yoshi, Emilia, for your participation in this wonderful discussion. I wish we could continue it, but I'm going to have to bring the webinar to a close. And Luke, if you wouldn't mind moving us to slide 34. We did have a lot of other information to share with you, but it's important to hear from the companies, I think, that the key message is you've heard a lot about the benefits of collaboration, and indeed we as a member-led organisation would really invite you to become involved in the work we're doing on TCFD. You have an opportunity here to demonstrate leadership by committing to implementing the TCFD recommendations, and therefore being part perhaps of the coalition that has been requested through the COP26 private finance strategy. Of course, people want to see that companies are implementing. As you may already know, the WBCSD membership criteria will now include a requirement for the implementation of TCFD. And we certainly want to work with companies to develop practices and guidances that will help you with that. We certainly want the way in which that's responded to be co-created with you. So please get in touch if you're interested in participating. Of course, as you've seen today, you get the opportunity by being involved to connect with others who are able to share their learnings and help you with their insights. And we know that beyond the ones that have been mentioned today, there are many other questions that remain and that need to be worked on in order to make climate change related disclosure really successful. And we invite you to work with us to tackle those challenges. So we're now at 10:30. And I just want to share one sort of personal reflection that when the pandemic was first announced, I did lots and lots of reading about what does it mean, how does it relate to climate, what can we do. It was such a shock, I think, to many of us. And there were two words that jumped out from all of the reading I did. One was collapse, which was pretty terrifying, and the other was collaborate. And I think we've shown today that collaboration certainly wins, and we can build back better through collaboration. So I'll end on that note. Thank you so much, all our speakers. Thank you to those who stayed with us. I think we had 100 online, so that's absolutely fantastic. You have our contact details. This will be available for you to view at another date. And I wish you a very good day and successful TCFD implementation. Bye, everybody.